I'll do my very best. My name is Morten Bøyås. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, and I would like to welcome all of you to this seminar about al-Shabaab and disengagement from al-Shabaab. I'm very pleased to see that we have such a huge turnout today to discuss this very important topic. And we also have a very strong panel here today. The first speaker is Stig Jarle Hansen, who is an associate professor at the University of Life Sciences in Ås, just outside of Oslo. Stig Jarle is also the author of this book, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is in many ways sort of the defining piece of scholarship on Shabaab in my point of view. So I'm very much looking forward to Stig Jarle's presentation. This presentation will be followed by a presentation by Professor Alexander Hitchens from King's College London, where he's also the head of research at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Alexander will first speak about the Western recruitment drive of al-Shabaab, and then that will be followed up by a presentation by his about the deradicalization. In between those two presentations from Alexander, NUPI's own Ingvild will be talking about disengagement from al-Shabaab. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes. Alexander, as it's giving two presentations, will have 10 minutes for each. So we'll try to stick to time. So I will also give a few comments at the end. And since there are so many people here, and so many people who also have knowledge about this subject, we really would like also to engage a lot with you. So without further ado, Stig Jarle, the floor is yours. 15 minutes, please.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here and speak on this important topic, a topic that I have been following since 2004. And, I've seen the Shabaab developing over time, and I'm thinking that I actually want to run through the developments of the Shabaab and the stages in the development of the Shabaab. There's a reason for me going through that, because I think each of these stages have different recruitment mechanisms. I think each of these stages holds lessons for the future. There's global ideas inside Shabaab. There are global causes of what happened in Somalia, but there's also local causes of what happened in Somalia as well. And the local causes are rather important, and it gives some signals about the future and what will happen in the future and the potential of the Shabaab in the future. Shabaab started out as a very small network. Some people say that the Shabaab was, in one sense, a subgroup of a previous organization called al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, who was founded in Hargeisa in 1983. It's not entirely precise because al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya was such a complex organization. It was a lot of things going on within that organization. Parts of that organization faltered because of clan reasons. Parts of the organization left. In general, al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, it had al-Qaeda connections, but it was a confused organization. It was plagued by clanism, and it had large problems. Rather, to study the early Shabaab, it becomes important to see and look into the activities of Somalis in Afghanistan in the 80s. It becomes important to look into the activities of al-Qaeda in East Africa in the 90s. It becomes important to look into the consequences of the war on terror inside Mogadishu. So what I'm saying is basically that the early Shabaab, it was a very small network. It was concentrated around several returnees from Afghanistan. It was concentrated amongst radicals, even radical for al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya. It was concentrated around former al-Qaeda activists. And this is a little bit special, ladies and gentlemen, because when I say al-Qaeda activists in the early Shabaab, basically leftovers. It's leftovers from al-Qaeda's original organization in East Africa. In the 90s, there was a lot of things going on for al-Qaeda in East Africa. In 1998, you had the embassy attacks. in Dar es Salaam and in Nairobi. And basically, it was coordinated at a high level inside the Al-Qaeda organization. But after 1998, Al-Qaeda's presence declined. And basically, the people active in this small network early in Shabaab history, firstly, it's doubtful that they had contact with Al-Qaeda Central. They were peripheral within the organization. Secondly, some of them were rather hesitant to have any form of inclusion into the early Shabaab organization. But this early phase, Shabaab wasn't really an organization. It was more like a network. When Shabaab crystallized as an organization was during the Sharia court, the autumn of 2006, during the Sharia court period. I think we should take something from that phase. If we change into a second phase, basically the growth of Shabaab, where they crystallized themselves in an organization, when they transformed themselves from a network into an organization. We talk about 2006, and we talk about specific causes for that. We talk about specific causes for a resurgence in religion in Somalia, because religion gave an alternative for justice, amongst other things. Warlords failed to provide justice. Sharia courts, when they grow, they provided justice. And religion in general provided a kind of cause of legitimacy. And there's a lot of indications on this from during the rise of the Sharia courts. Amongst others, business leaders who take religious titles because they want to improve their image. So it was a positive feeling around religion at the time. Religion was seen as something tying Somalis together, and religion was seen as a kind of alternative that can provide justice. And on this wave rode the early Shabaab. The early Shabaab rode on the wave of the rise of the Sharia courts on Mogadishu. They had several advantages. They were more global in inclination than the rest of the Sharia courts. They were more strongly Islamist. That meant that they could transcend clan. And clan was a problem for the early Sharia courts. They were rather fanatical. That means that they also fought relatively good in battles. So during the Sharia courts, you have the growth of a super organization inside the courts called the Shabaab. It's easy to stereotype the Shabaab during those years. It was not the militant part of the courts. It was a part of the courts together with a lot of subgroups. The third phase in Shabaab history is after the fall of the Sharia court. It's after the fall of the Sharia courts hosted by Ethiopian forces in December 2006, where the Shabaab transformed itself into a guerrilla organization. It became a guerrilla organization. Interestingly, ladies and gentlemen, not fighting that much wars in 2007, being reluctant to engage Ethiopians in the early phase of their history, allowing other clan factions to engage, but using a lot of symbolic attacks, like suicide attacks, to gain a lot of attention. So by 2007, you see a resurgence of Shabaab activity, but early 2007, Shabaab is very laid back. They are organizing, they are part of the opposition, but they are rather weak when it comes to direct attacks. In 2008, we see more attacks. And again, the international society plays the game into Shabaab's hands. They play the game into Shabaab's hands by a lot of fake justice reforms. So again, Shabaab is earning on an approach to justice by the international society and also by the transitional government, Western-backed transitional government, who is simply not working. Shabaab's advantage during those years was simply that you had a police force that was trained by the international community, but it never received pay. So it was a highly corrupt police force. And Shabaab again played on justice and the provision of justice in their propaganda, together with their global message. So the global message is something that is studied a lot, but the local message and the local message surrounding the provision of justice hasn't been that much studied. So it's very important. That's why the original title of this book actually was Jihad and Justice, because justice was so important for the early Shabaab. And of course, it's easy to point to justice when you don't have the possibility to do it, because at that stage, Shabaab didn't have territorial control. When you had the peace agreement in 2008, and the Ethiopians withdrew their forces, and the general international community underestimated the Shabaab, and that's something that happens a lot, underestimating the Shabaab. Then this changed, because when the Ethiopians withdrew, the new forces of the Sharia force that joined with the government simply collapsed, and the Shabaab conquered most of southern Somalia. So central Somalia became Shabaab territory. So then you have, in one sense, a fourth phase where you have Shabaab taking territorial control. and actually having the opportunity to do their justice implementation and doing governance. Wasn't a brilliant success story, but still during this phase, you saw the Shabaab going in and doing governance much better than elements of the transitional federal government that was backed by the West. So at this stage, you can see, for example, big queues outside the Sharia courts run by the Shabaab in Mogadishu compared to total neglect and ignorance from the population with regards to the so-called courts put up by the government in Mogadishu. So you still have some kind of popularity on the side of the Shabaab. But at the same time, there's developments inside the Shabaab that is undermining the Shabaab. Taxation is not easy if you want to do it by a newly established local administration, or even worse, if you want to use international jihadists to do taxation. So it wasn't really popular. And of course, you can really see the harsh practice of Sharia when Shabaab is actually controlling territories. Secondly, you have these indoctrination classes where you're actually trying to teach Somalis more global jihadist inclinations. Not always very successful. I visited Mogadishu in 2012. I talked to some of the Somalis that participated in these training camps that actually was in a retraining program by the government, and they were actually laughing when we were talking about how Palestinians and Pakistanis in these classes talked about what was going on in Iraq, etc. So it didn't seem like it influenced them a lot, but it was an attempt to influence them, and it was attempts to systematize and centralize the Shabaab. The last phase, and in one sense the phase that is still ongoing in Shabaab history, is starting with an all-out attack and all-out attempt by the Shabaab to really conquer southern Somalia in 2010, the autumn of 2010. Basically, the last forces resisting the Shabaab was the AMISOM forces of Uganda and Burundi. There wasn't any others. Uganda and Burundi, they grouped out in some kind of L formation, and the Shabaab wanted to separate them, basically attack the middle of that L formation. So they wanted to really conquer Mogadishu, which at the time was actually an idea that made sense on paper, but in reality perhaps didn't make that much sense because Uganda and Burundi simply was much better equipped than the Shabaab. The Shabaab actually quite impressively managed to mobilize larger forces to attack and lost very heavily. And this loss destabilized the Shabaab. And this is the phase of destabilization that is actually to a certain extent still going on, where you have the loss of the Shura Council. The Shura Council, the top leadership group of the Shabaab, it's not easy to call it in anymore. The various Shabaab leaders blame the defeat on each other, and simply have a hard time agreeing on strategy issues. They simply have a hard time agreeing on how to organize themselves for the future after this defeat. There is a discussion around guerrilla warfare and territoriality. Should you keep territories? Should you yield territories? And there's a blame game going on after the offensive inside Mogadishu, where you have Mukhtar Robo blaming the defeat on Budana, Hassan Yaqoubi blaming the defeat on Mukhtar Robo. So there's a lot of things going on in the organization. And then the Shabaab is suffering defeats after defeats. And they are suffering first the propaganda loss when it comes to abroad inside Somalia. They are suffering when the Kenyans are entering the conflict, and the Ethiopians are re-entering the conflict. So we will have 2011, 2012. Certainly, there's a lot of new forces entering into Somalia, and the Shabaab can't simply militarily hope to withstand those forces as long as they're unified. And thus lose out and lose territory quite drastically until this year. And as we speak, they're losing even more territories in an Ethiopian offensive that we can see sketched here. What is happening to the Shabaab, though, is that there is elements of regionalization in the Shabaab. So while they are losing in Somalia, you can see signs that there is much more focus on Swahili propaganda focusing southwards. You can see that Kenyan foreign fighters inside Somalia actually make up a rather large component of the Shabaab. You can see that there's activities in Tanzania. You can see that there's indications of activities in Uganda and Ethiopia, although this is hard to say because of the Ugandan and Ethiopian police and their violations of human rights, basically. So it's hard to see what's going on. You can also see this year that there's a reconsolidation where it seems like the leadership around Budane is getting on top after a big showdown inside the organization. So there seems to be a rebound. But ladies and gentlemen, just to wrap up, the dilemmas that faced Ethiopians first time they were in Somalia, they're still there. There's a run to establish Somali institutions before AMISOM pulls out. And that's very important. And if those institutions are not established, there will not be any stabilization of Somalia. It's as simple as that. The AMISOM forces that are there today, they cannot hope to secure the countryside. So as for now, you can see the non-colored dots on this map is basically areas of Somalia that are not under control by the government or the AMISOM forces. And the AMISOM forces have a stretched, forces. So today you have a situation where AMISOM can not be defeated in open combat, but also when AMISOM don't have any hopes to actually make Somalia safe in the countryside. So they don't have a hope to defeat the Shabaab militarily, but the Shabaab cannot defeat them in open combat over the larger cities. So that is what you have to take into consideration. The second thing you have to take into consideration is the status of the Somali army and the status of the Somali police. Will it be that the international community and the Somali government again creates police forces that they are not paid? That's very serious. So far, President Hassan, he has focused on that. He has ensured that you actually have the means to pay the police. We have to watch this in the future and not take it for granted. Again, what we see now over the last months is President Hassan and the military firing a whole battalion of 700 men fully equipped. That's a bad deal for a new Somali army. That means that we have a lot of other insurgents running around inside Mogadishu. What we also see now is the government's failure to handle security in Mogadishu. That was the Somali government's responsibility. It has declined. You have some really heavy attacks inside Mogadishu these days. I guess that's all I have for today. I'll leave it to the next speaker.
Thank you, Sigurd. Oh yeah, it's here. You found it? Okay, great. Thank you, Stig, and thanks, Intel, for inviting me here. I should, just before I start, echo what Stig said about East Africa, Swahili speaking East Africa being of greater interest. I've done some fieldwork there myself, and I'd be happy to discuss it afterwards. But I'm here now to talk to you a little bit about something slightly further away from there, which is al-Shabaab's outreach to Westerners, particularly through a fairly sophisticated media strategy. It's worth saying, the recruitment of people living in the West, both from the Somali diaspora and converts, and other sort of Western Muslims, is very different. Usually, the recruitment of Somalis, the latter, things like clan affiliation, money, status, are much more influential in the decision to join. Whereas, with people traveling from the West to one of the toughest battlefields in the world, there's something else driving them. And that's what we're trying to give a little bit here. By analyzing the al-Shabaab media output aimed at Westerners, what we're trying to look at here is what al-Shabaab has identified as the pull factors for potential Western recruits. And it's also widely a useful case study of how jihadist organizations, or at least organizations with jihadist elements in them, look to attract Westerners. This also has a relevance to incidents in London the last few months. As you know, we had a killing of John Lee Rigby, a British soldier, by Michael Bolajo, Nigerian convert, well, British Nigerian convert to Islam, who had tried to join al-Shabaab sometime previously. So he was attracted by this outreach himself. He was caught in Kenya on the way there. In the report, this is actually based on a report we wrote a couple of years ago, so it is a little bit dated, but it does, and I've tried to update it with you guys here today as well. But we sort of divided the output between ideological as well as more pure propaganda output. Like other AQ affiliates, Shabaab has recognized the importance of providing their own alternatives to mainstream media, pursuing a media strategy by producing English language videos presented as documentaries and news reports
from the front lines and by sending out press releases as well intermittently. And also, as we know, building a presence on Twitter. I'm going to look at each of these briefly to give you an overview. Our report actually provides the first quantitative analysis of their Twitter output between a period between December 2011 and April 2012. It was from their original account, and we coded those and were able to sort of distinguish the different focuses there. So here we have the four main goals that we've identified for this propaganda and outreach. As I mentioned, this provision of an alternative to the mainstream media is very important. It allows them to attract new recruits, strengthen the resolve of existing members, and provides a conduit through which recruits and potential recruits can also get in touch with interactive sectors of the senior leadership, take control of the coverage of their actions and decisions so that they can give their own spin, as it were, on what they're doing compared to the sort of negative press they tend to get. Also project this impression of a professional, structurally cohesive group, which they're not really. In many cases, I'll demonstrate how they try and do that. And also trying to demonstrate that it remains an effective and united force for carrying out the will of God by implementing Sharia justice, as you were mentioning, and fighting against global enemies of religion. This is a screenshot from one of their videos. It's actually a couple years old now, but it's a good example. This was presented as a news report from the front lines, the so-called Battle of Denile. It's a district of Mogadishu. Took place between Shabaab and Burundian African Union troops, and was presented by a British accented man with space cover who appears to have Somali origins. It's a good example of the effort they've made to control the news about them and their activities. Three main goals of this documentary-style video, or rather, sorry, news report-style video. This was one, again, was to refute the allegations from the Western media of al-Shabaab's imminent defeat in the area, to claim that it was in fact the African Union that was causing most of the atrocities, showing footage of burned out houses, etc. And also to fuel the idea that the West and the African Union is engaged in this concerted war on Islam that we know is a major part of the global jihadist ideology. It includes footage of the spokesman, Ali Muhammad Raj, holding up a cross and Bible found on the bodies of one of the Burundian soldiers as an attempt to show this sort of Christian crusade. This is the British accented reporter. We don't exactly know who he is. Many people would like to know. We're not sure if he's even still alive. But it does seem to be a British element to a lot of what they're doing, and a British theme to some of that, and I'll mention that. Just some shots from the video of these sort of supposedly jubilant crowds welcoming al-Shabaab into the area. And this is the attempt to prove the sort of global element to this fight. This is a spokesman holding out the cross and Bible found on the soldier that I mentioned. Now, moving on to the sort of documentary-style videos, so I'll sort of rush through this. The one I'll briefly look at here is called Under the Shade of the Sharia, and it includes the same reporter as I mentioned before. And this particular documentary is about how the situation with al-Shabaab was greatly improved due to their implementation, again, of Sharia law and the justice that Stig was talking about. It's actually based in Baidoa, which of course is no longer in control of al-Shabaab, south-central Somali city. But at the time, it was made when they had managed to take some control over it. And it shows footage of how the town was supposedly in ruins before Shabaab's heroic arrival, and footage of the sort of vast improvements that apparently took place since their takeover at the time. We see interviews with locals claiming, apparently not under duress, that their businesses were now booming, justice had been brought, security was there, and Sharia law was certainly the best way forward for them. Just a screen grab from the documentary. You can see at the bottom there the supposed HSM stats of HSM is short for Harakat Shabaab al-Mujahideen. And apparently they have a stats office where to take that seriously. And again, this is what I mentioned, this attempt to provide an image of organizational capacity that probably isn't really there. This is some of the press releases they intermittently send out. It's actually from my own inbox, you can probably tell. Again, attempt to demonstrate structural cohesion, professionalism, supposed media wing here, sending out information to Western journalists and other analysts who are interested in the group. And you can see again here a British focus. This is actually about a guy called Bilal al-Birawi, a Lebanese-born but British-raised foreign fighter who died fighting for Shabaab apparently has the drone strike. Again, they don't do this for everyone who dies. This was specifically aimed at Westerners trying to glorify this kind of action, showing him to be the ideal type of Western Muslim. Here another one focusing on the case of Abu Qatada. I don't know how much you guys follow that. In England, there was a long-running case where we were trying to deport him. He was an al-Qaeda recruiter in the UK and sort of known as bin Laden's right-hand man in Europe. This was a big story at the time, and we were trying to extradite him to Jordan. And it seems that they had their hand on the pulse, or their fingers on the pulse, of what kind of discussions were going on in the UK and in the West more broadly regarding the treatment of Muslims. And again, trying to take advantage of this and showing it as a, as they say here, travesty of justice. Finally, or the second to last, their Twitter output. This was really done, we did this analysis during the sort of height of their Western outreach campaign, which has died down recently due to a lot of the reasons that Stig mentioned. We took, in the analysis, we took 6 months of their output, coded it and placed them in these sort of analytical categories that I've laid out here, with the goal of discerning really what their biggest focus was in this form of outreach. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we'll quickly discuss some of the more important ones. As you can see here, narrative is one of the most sort of important issues for them, along with operational capacity and competing voices. What do those mean? Well, judging from the data set we used, their primary aim was to promote one of the overarching Shabaab narratives, namely a global one for their Western audience, presenting AU, African Union forces, and Somali government were defined as proxies of the West, as being at war with Islam and Muslims and being complicit in this global conspiracy. Secondly, their most important, second most important messaging for them at the time was the operational capacity that I mentioned, trying to show the group is one which has the ability to carry out effective operations, which will be able to continue to do so for the future, and is therefore a realistic option for someone wanting to offer their services to the movement. We'll have to look at their ideological output, and I'll end with a video that we've got lined up in a second. But this is a more ideologically focused effort. One of the best examples of this, which I'll show a clip of, is produced by Al-Qaeda, the Shabaab media wing. It was called Inspire the Believers, and it was specifically aimed at Muslims in the West, and particularly English-speaking Muslims. And it featured a sort of carousel of foreign fighters, many of them ethnic Somalis, who migrated to the country in support of al-Shabaab. And before I show you the clip, I just want to give you some background on what they're discussing, namely the question of hijra, or migration. I'm not sure how many are familiar with this. It's got many different meanings, but in the global jihadi setting, it has quite a specific one. These young men are referred to as al-Muhajirin. In fact, you'll see this being used to refer to Syrian foreign fighters now as well. It's essentially Muslims who have made the hijra, and their actions are really presented as striving to achieve the ultimate glory in Islam. What is the hijra? Why is it relevant to the sort of global jihadist messaging? Very briefly, it refers to the migration initially made by Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Medina in response to the persecution they were receiving the local tribes there. And it's considered a crucial moment in the history of the religion. And this was highly glorified. And the Muhajirin who went with him, his followers, are seen to be people who must be now emulated. It contains, it's got a very profound significance in Islamic theology, but it also has it, so for our present purpose, for global jihadist ideology, it's very relevant because all the Quranic verses relating to jihad actually revealed only after Muhammad made the hijra. Before then, the concept of jihad didn't really even exist. Jihadists attach a huge significance to this, therefore. They reason that hijra took Muhammad to Medina, where God delivered him political authority, security, and the ability to wage battle against their enemies. Thus, without hijra, there is no jihad as far as they're concerned. And it's therefore seen by global jihadis as a sort of strategic necessity and precursor to jihad, and providing an opportunity to organize and prepare for battle. And we'll see them talk about this. And the video itself is just 2 minutes, I think is what I've got left. It also presents Shabaab's mission in more sort of global cosmic terms. Civilizational conflict between the forces of Islam and non-Islam, truth and falsehood, good and evil. And the dichotomy really is thus established, and the West essentially being locked in this existential conflict with Islam and cannot exist with it, and really the idea that to reject one party in that polarization is to side with the other. And the approach here is to try and create this unbearable tension for Muslims in the West, forcing them to essentially pick a side. And if you go ahead with the video, hopefully it will work, fingers crossed. We can see there's two speakers here, one English and one slightly more close to home for the audience here. You get going.
I'd like to take this opportunity to restore them Eid Mubarak and to invite all the Muslims who are living in the lands of disbelief, the lands of oppression, to make hijrah to the land of glory, to the land of Izzah, to the land of jihad. وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بسم الله الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. يا الله من brother sister Israeli bröder så vill jag säga assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Och vi är här just nu i Mogadishu, huvudstaden i Somalia. Och jag står just nu i en av huvudstadens gamla arenor. Bröder och systrar, jag besänder mina varmaste hälsningar som sagt. Och min andra hälsning till er och min andra uppmaning till er är att ni gör hijra till det här landet. Att ni gör hijra från över kuffar till över islam som wajib på er. Och att ni tar del av denna kamp, denna gott och ont, mellan mörker och ljus, mellan hatt och vapen. Bröder och systrar, jag uppmanar er att komma hit till Somalia, att göra jihad här i Somalia, som Somalia är en del av den nationella jihaden. Jag vill sända min varning också till den Lars Lix som gjorde teckningen på profeten sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jag vill säga till Lars Lix, vart du befinner dig, vart du är, om inte idag, om inte idag, så vet att vi har inte glömt vad du har gjort. Vi kommer ta dig.
Go ahead and pause that. So you can see there, just to conclude really, you know, generally you wouldn't have thought Al-Shabaab would have been too bothered about Lars Vilks and the English cartoon fiasco, or the Muhammad cartoon fiasco, but you can see there the attempt to place Shabaab in that global, as a global vanguard, as fighting in one of the global fronts in this war for the survival of Islam, and incorporating all these sort of global elements that otherwise, you know, domestically the Shabaab audience wouldn't be so interested in, but for the Westerners, clearly is important. And with that, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for having to do this presentation. Right. Okay. So they have focusing on how people actually get recruited into Al-Shabaab, and I will be talking about how people get out of Al-Shabaab. Is it actually possible to get out of Al-Shabaab if you maybe were into it? And what I wanted to start with saying is that Alex was talking about how people also can be recruited at an international level, but locally in Somalia, not all go in because of their rank beliefs or because of agreeing with Al-Shabaab's ideology. Many go in for other reasons, for local reasons, for security, because Al-Shabaab is the one who have built a power vacuum, like Stian was saying. The state has not been present, and the only actor in that area has been Al-Shabaab, providing security for people, who are providing livelihood as well. Being able to pay the fighters or pay family members of the fighters. Or that also fighters have been from a minority, which makes it more attractive to go into Al-Shabaab, as you don't have the strength of a local base and can't live it. But if you go into Al-Shabaab, you actually have a chance to get more power and more safety in the area. So I think these are things that are important for us to keep in mind.
Over ørene.
You should have had that too.
Yes, but not all the fighters within al-Shabaab are actually going in because of their radical beliefs. They might be radicalized while they're in the group. People are doing, al-Shabaab are doing trainings for them, training camps, etc. But that's for the larger percentage of people going in from the Somali area are not actually re-radicalized. So that makes it a lot easier for us to help them getting out. So what I've been doing, this recent project, is trying to figure out how are the processes of motivating people to come out of al-Shabaab, what can we offer them, and looking at different efforts within Somalia to try to see how this can be done. And I've done several field visits to Somalia the last year, speaking to the UN, speaking to the African Union forces in Somalia, AMISOM, the Federal Government of Somalia, and other local and international actors involved in this process. So, actually, reports are saying that there's quite a high level of people within al-Shabaab that are motivated already to come out for several reasons. And as a response to that, the National Program for the Treatment and Handling of Disengaged Fighters in Somalia was created in 2013. It's now being set up. It was developed mainly by the UN and IOM, but it is national-led, and the government is increasingly taking control of the program. UNSOM, the UN Mission in Somalia, IOM, UNICEF, and AMISOM are also highly involved in these processes. So the main aim of the program is to address the security challenges by providing response to and handling of disengaged fighters, and then creating the grounds for developing further frameworks of doing that, because the framework is basically not there. So this is an immediate response while they're trying to develop more sustainable solutions and programming aspects. So it's basically, for now, 4 centers. That's going to be the first stage when people have decided to disengage. And those centers are located in Mogadishu, in Baidoa, to the west, in Beledweyne, a bit further up, and then Kismayo, which is not marked on the map, but is closer to that, to the Kenyan border. 2 centers have been set up already in Mogadishu. That one has been running for 2 years. Last year, 1 center was set up in Beledweyne, and they're now working on setting up the center in Baidoa and Kismayo as well. So the idea is that they are supposed to be coming to these centers, being screened before, and then receive some type of vocational skills training while they're there. The idea is to keep them as short time as possible within the center, because it's a high focus on social reintegration and getting them back into the communities. However, that is quite complicated in many of these areas because al-Shabaab is still present in many of the areas that these guys are coming from, which I'll talk a bit more about the security aspects. Children and youth under the age of 18 go into a separate process, and high-risk individuals are supposed to go into a judicial process and going to a trial. So what is really interesting with this case is that you're trying to do disengagement during conflict. The concept of DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, is that it should be a peace agreement in place, and you should have a minimal of security in the areas that you're working in. In Somalia, that is not the case at all. So security becomes one of the main issues for these guys coming out. And this is a picture that I took in Baidoa during a field visit there in December. One of the commanders from the African Union forces, showing us on the map where the African Union forces are, and the red dots are al-Shabaab. This is in Baidoa. So you see that al-Shabaab is pretty much all around, but in the center, in actually the area where they're taken, or the area of the town of Baidoa itself. The map is outdated now. It's the geopits that are in the area, but it still shows how the security situation really shapes what we're actually able to do. How do you reintegrate people into those communities where al-Shabaab is still present? So while in Baidoa, we had a working group with different people from the community represented to discuss how to put up this center in Baidoa. And one of the people from the soldiers from AMISOM told me is that because they meet people coming out of al-Shabaab on a regular basis, and they said to me that they, meaning al-Shabaab, will only disengage if they're promised security. That is their main issue and demand. So that's something that this program needs to take on quite seriously. Are we actually able to provide security for the people coming out of al-Shabaab? Al-Shabaab themselves have made quite an effective strategy when it comes to people disengaging. You probably heard about the Aminiyat, who have been actually targeting people going out or people from their families, which is a quite effective strategy of keeping people within the group. So fear is one of the main obstacles to people going out. So that's something that the program needs to deal with very seriously. Are we able to provide for their security? Some of the challenges involved trying to set up this kind of program in Somalia. The judicial framework is not present to deal with these kind of cases. When it comes to the high-risk cases, meaning leaders or highly radicalized people, what do you do with them? The national framework, judicial framework, is basically not there. And then what do you do? You put them in sectors with other people that are not that radicalized. That is an issue. That is a problem as well. So that is a huge challenge. You need to have that sort of system in place. Then you have the local political and clan dynamics. People have, of course, different interests in the different areas. The center that they're trying to put up in Baidoa, that region is now actually going through a quite heavy political process, where there's more than 23, I think, clans involved with their different politics. And to be able to set up a center there, you must know what's going on. You must know who are the actors to get involved with, who are the actors to engage. Because if you don't really have the local ownership, it's going to be really, really complicated to try to disengage and reintegrate people coming out of al-Shabaab into the communities again. And that's something that international actors might not be the best at when it comes to DDR. Something we discussed in a workshop with Mogadishu this week. So that is something that needs to be highly focused on, and that the government and the communities themselves actually take responsibility for this process. And the UN doesn't have the best reputation in Somalia, so this is something that has to be locally led, which is the same thing in Kismayo as well. Then it's the receptiveness of the communities. Stidiaga mentioned that a lot of these communities are quite positive towards al-Shabaab because they're actually bringing in security. How is the community going to receive people coming back in? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? What kind of social relations do you have there? Do you still have people that are related to al-Shabaab? What is that going to? How is that going to relate to your own security, etc.? And then there's the issue of stigmatization, which is a big problem in DDR programs in general. A lot of people have come out of al-Shabaab already, and they have gone into the local communities. They have been gone to Nairobi or to other countries, so they have left already. But we're not actually Muslims comment is that when you go through such a program, you get the stamp of being an ex-combatant, or you get the stamp of being al-Shabaab. And that's something that we need to be careful about. And people will know, like in the community, people will know that these guys are coming from al-Shabaab. So the stigmatization within the community can be a problem in this process. Then is the issue of psychosocial support, which is not something that is done a lot in Somalia, to my knowledge, and it must also be highly localized. It must be done on their premises. A lot of these guys were recruited quite young, going into this group as children, going to training, and also being asked and commanded to do a high level of violence. And that's something that must be dealt with when they're coming out. I mean, if that's what they know, how to do, if weapon is their way of surviving, then we need to work on that when they come out. How that's going to be done in Somalia, not really sure. Then the reintegration phase. They have now built up these 4 different types of centers. 2 are already in place, as I mentioned. But how long are these disengaged fighters going to be in the centers, and how are they going to be reintegrated into the community afterwards? The process in between there is quite challenging, and it needs to be thought out a bit better. Because if they're actually in the center, it's under what's the English word? Anyway, we have the sort of the responsibility for that. And we can't just send them back into the communities and expect that will be just fine. They're setting up some different programs for them, types of livelihood, etc. But that needs to be revised much better. What is actually needed for them when they want to go back to the community? What kind of skills do they actually need? And what sort of social processes do we also need to build on when they go back? That was just like a short overview of what's being done when it comes to disengagement in Somalia. This is a picture from a working group that we had in Baidoa, trying to discuss these issues and see how we can set up a center up here as well.
Great.
Is it that?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have worn this before. I feel like I work for Google or Apple or something. Now, I've given this talk once before, yesterday, in fact, to a different audience, but Nairobi. So for those who were there, my deepest sympathies. So you've heard about disengagement, which is a pretty well-established practice and something that has a lot of work behind it. This is quite a newer and more controversial subject and approach. And it's, of course, overlapped in some ways with disengagement. But if we were to consider the future and current conflicts and the militias that we'll be dealing with are likely to be more influenced, at least in places, by ideas, it may be worth looking at ways of addressing those ideas and perhaps countering them, delegitimizing them. And that's really what deradicalization tries to do, and it can be done as part of an overall disengagement program, and something which can, in fact, be also incorporated into the judicial framework that you mentioned. This is really based on a report we wrote actually a while back, but we've updated a couple of times since. It was a team of researchers went out to a number of different countries and analyzed the existing DRAD programs out there at the moment. Of course, they're all very different, and what we're trying to do here is give you an overview as much as possible of these kind of programs and try and identify some of the key ingredients that may be considered if if something like this is implemented in Somalia, that will really depend on the necessity of it. If it is something that is required, if there is enough of an ideological element there that is worth pursuing such a program. Just a basic outline of the talk. I'll give you some of the core ideas and concepts around this, and some of the terms, sorry, and then talk a bit from DRAD and the ingredients I mentioned, and finally some concluding thoughts. So, just some of the key terms we're going to look at: deradicalization, disengagement. While both are important and relevant to the context of my talk and can sometimes be seen as overlapping, they're also quite different, and the shape a program is going to take depends very much on the approach that's pursued. So disengagement really does refer to the process of an individual or group ceasing engagement in any violence. That was the previous MO. And the focus then is really on actions, and the goal is to make them cease what they're previously doing. DRAD, on the other hand, refers to the process of rejecting or abandoning previously held extremist beliefs. So the focus here is on the ideas held by the target group. So, you can disengage from a group, but it doesn't mean that you've rejected the ideas that drive it. And if you haven't, considering how Somalia is really defined with these kind of cycles of violence, if you disengage from a group but still believe in its mission ideologically, then you may well find yourself going back in when the opportunity arises. So it's something you should take into consideration. But it is a very big challenge. Just very quickly, you can also look at those in those kind of terms, sort of cognitive de-radicalization. We also have the terms that we come across now: counter-radicalization. Differs from the previous two in terms of audience. We're talking about people who would be targeted, the kind of people who would be targeted by such a program, or would sort of be in the thrall of an extremist group or its ideas. Or also those who are sort of vulnerable to those ideas, but haven't really broken the law, haven't joined the group, haven't done anything wrong really yet, but have been identified as possibly heading that way. Essentially, this would be a kind of inoculation program, and we've seen in Europe attempts to implement these with varying degrees of success. You can maybe think of them as something like a anti-drug or gang programs in inner cities, where you try and identify kids from communities where they join gangs before they do, and try and give them all the reasons why they shouldn't. And it's kind of scared straight programs and all those kind of things. You've heard these referred to in America as countering violent extremism, Britain preventing violent extremism, and there are programs like that in place already at the moment. Now we've also seen some shades of gray here, how de-radicalization programs in Europe and the Middle East and other Muslim majority countries often include elements of counter-radicalization, so they're not necessarily completely separate. Counter-radicalization programs can also be part of a wider DRAD program, in that you look to pursue that kind of counter messaging in the sort of society or a community in which you're looking to reintegrate a de-radicalized member so that they don't just fall back straight to the same problems. So moving on quickly to the bulk of the talk on de-radicalization and identifying sort of three different types, different types. First, of the intervention variety, an authority steps in and intervenes in the life of a person who's beginning to adopt violent extremist views. The person has not yet broken the law, and the intervention does not take place within a prison or in the cases of sort of already convicted criminals. This is more common in the West, this type of approach, where both US and UK, as I mentioned, have developed these kind of intervention programs. You also have exit programs. This looks at the other side of the process, where interventions, which the interventions look at, and on those who are in the process of getting out of what they used to do. In the Saudi Arabian and Algerian cases, and a number of others who run these kind of programs, or have run those kind of programs as well in the past. Part of this kind of exit program, a latter stage of it, was to provide sort of jihadi detainees who've gone through the program with financial security. And in Algeria, in fact, we saw attempts to provide former FIS members with their old jobs, if at all possible. The third type, unlike the first two, is more traditionally detention center based. The first of this type is a sort of collective de-radicalization program. The best example of this is the Egyptian Jamaat Islamiyah in the late 90s, terrorist organization there that essentially took the decision as a group, once they were all put in prison, that violence was not any longer working for them, and that they were actually ideologically renounced it. The group actually, from prison, approached the government and wanted to enter this sort of almost peace process kind of dialogue. But of course, this needs to be done. This can only really happen in the case of groups that have very clear command and control structures and hierarchies. But it was very effective in Egypt, and it was referred to as al-Munajat, the revisions, where senior members went around recruiting their old fellow members in prison and changing their minds, essentially. Second type of prison-based program is the individual programs, aimed at individuals, again, who've handed themselves in or been captured. Saudi, again, is probably the most well-known, sort of incorporates a couple of these types. So I'm moving very quickly into the 6 sort of core ingredients we've identified in what may be an effective program, or what may things you have to consider in these kind of programs. First is assessment. So you got to ask yourself, is DRAD an appropriate approach to dealing with this person or group? In doing this, we have to gauge and assess which individuals are hardcore ideologues, motivated by violent extremist set of beliefs, and which are simply foot soldiers who join for a host of reasons. But of course, you may join for one reason and then become indoctrinated after that. So that has to also be considered. Assessment also can identify leadership and foot soldier and more junior people, and therefore allow you to separate groups of people, and those who you can work with, those who you can't, those who have bad influences on the other. So you assess that and move from there. It also allows us to determine if a DRAD program is indeed appropriate. Are we dealing with a significant amount of individuals who are motivated largely by these ideas? And if so, such a program may be suitable. At the other end of the process, assessment can also look at an individual who's been through a DRAD program and determine if they still pose a threat and if they can be released, or is it perhaps likely they will keep to their new beliefs or revert back to their old ones. If they do revert back, are they likely to then recruit from within their community which they've been reintegrated to? So those are kind of assessments you've got to do. This kind of assessment will begin while the individual is detained, but should also continue post-release for a significant amount of time in order to mitigate chances of recidivism. Secondly, one of the most sort of contentious debates really among students of radicalization is about the role of religiously inspired ideology in the process that leads to the involvement in violence, violent extremism. In other words, does ideology matter? It's an important question, as it will have a significant impact on the nature of the type of program that's going to be pursued. So it should come as no surprise that actually almost all of the programs we looked at, in fact all of them, did have an ideological component, so they did take this seriously. But it's worth mentioning that as well as religious and ideological sort of re-education, they've used a number of other instruments prison programming, especially education and professional training. So really this ingredient is an existing sort of mix of programs, so not just ideological retraining, but a number of other things that are very important in this. That's a picture there from the Saudi program, includes sort of recreational stuff as well. We've seen a number of programs. Number of programs that contain a substantive element of religious and ideological re-education, and all of them share the notion of terrorists as essentially victims whose religious ideas are based on misinformation and lack of proper knowledge of the religion, making re-education both necessary and possible. We've seen this in Yemen, Saudi, Philippines, Singapore. Also important to have credible interlocutors. If we were to think of an imam as one of these, which would be utilized by the DRAD program. Indeed, many such programs do rely on imams. Not only would they have to be sort of having the requisite academic qualifications, but they should also display strong interpersonal skills and charisma and really help forge relationships with prisoners both during and after such a program. And in fact, in many cases, you are not hired simply on the basis of your credentials. You have to also show sort of brotherly qualities, as it were. In Indonesia and Afghanistan, in fact, we saw how they didn't use imams at all. They went for former fighters instead, former members of the group. They found them to be more effective. We're back online here. So that's another crucial consideration you've got to take into account when developing this kind of program. Fourthly, the crucial focus on transition back into society, and this is where it overlaps with disengagement that you mentioned. or so-called sort of aftercare, what happens after the program. So while the program is going on and the person is involved in this process, the work should also really be taking place on how to achieve reconciliation between them and their families or other members of their communities or clans who often disavow or disown rather or reject individuals who have been involved in such groups. The family is a very important post-release sort of support system which will need to be in place or some other type of sort of social support system be in place in order to ensure that a former detainee does not revert back to their old ways. The Saudi program is probably the most extensive in this regard, and we've seen such an approach also pursued in Singapore and Indonesia. So in the Somali context, our preliminary assessment is that we would have to focus on ensuring that clan elders, for example, of a certain area where a former detainee will be rehoused, are fully briefed on what's going on, both during the process and after, and agreements will need to be reached with them about if it's really possible to put these guys back in the local communities. Creating commitments linked to this, creation and maintenance of commitments made on behalf of the detainee. The goal here again is to make the move back into violence very costly and not really worth it. It's important therefore to ensure that detainees commit to multiple parties or partners, be that a wife, other family member, new employer, imam, something like that. Thinking here again is that the offenders, in order for them to desist from deviant behavior or returning to their old behaviors, it's essential to facilitate their reintegration into mainstream social networks, encouraging them to establish stable commitments outside of extremist circles. In other words, the more committed a former terrorist is to social networks away from extremism, the fewer opportunities there will be to return to violence, and the higher the social cost of reoffending. Family is a very important focal point here as well. And just, oops. Finally, material inducements, probably the most sort of controversial aspect of this, essentially paying people off or giving them material reasons not to continue. Saudi program, perhaps most infamous to do this, providing detainees with cars, families, like wives, jobs, and all those kind of things in return for commitments. But there are some important caveats here. Though it's not necessarily completely out of the question to pursue this, you cannot base a program primarily on bribery, but it can succeed if it's done in conjunction with some of the other ingredients that I mentioned. If it's only based on bribery, it will in the end collapse and fail once the money runs out. So they have to be tied to previously mentioned commitments, for example. So we talk about money, a released detainee must stay true to his commitment to his employer, thus ensuring ongoing income. So, you know, do these kind of programs actually work? I think we can probably discuss that in the, so I'm overrunning slightly here, so I'll leave it at that. And thank you again.
Can I ask panelists to come up here, please? Just share the box. Thank you for very interesting and stimulating presentations. Let me just start by just asking a couple of questions to the panelists before I leave it open to the floor. First, to the presentation of Stig-Jarle and also the first presentation of Alexander. In my point of view, it could be interesting if you could expand a little bit on how al-Shabaab, yes, I mean, it's an insurgency, it's a network, but it's also an organization, in my point of view, that to a considerable extent also have certain state-like features, and parts of its practice, be it both internally in Somalia, but also its external outreach is very much mimicking a state, and in a way sort of also projecting images both internally and externally of a state in the making, an alternative to the Somali state, to the extent that such a state at all exist. And that may be part of its attractiveness. The very fact that it's able to project certain images of statehood and an alternative idea about statehood in Somalia than that is quite different to the ideas about the Somali statehood that is being projected right now from Mogadishu and from the AU and the UN and international partners. And could it be the fact that, at least for some people, I mean, the idea of an alternative statehood that al-Shabaab is projecting seems more feasible, more able to succeed in current Somalia than the project that we as the international community are trying to brand and project. And that parts of this puzzle about the attractiveness and thereby also the difficulty of, or should we say, defeating and also getting people out of al-Shabaab is based on this more than other aspects of the organization. So I would very much like both of you to at least try to expand a little bit on that, particularly since I know that both of you have interesting views concerning that. Then my second sort of broad question would be to the presentations by Ingvild and the second presentation by Alexander, which sort of deals with the issue, both of them with the issue of sort of disengagement / deradicalization. I think it would be interesting if you could sort of expand a little bit on what actually separates the disengagement program in Somalia from similar DDR programs elsewhere. And it's more probably both similarities and differences that cuts across this, that this is being done in a place without a peace agreement. One program that it could be interesting to try to draw some lessons from is the program on, I don't think I should call it disengagement, but in reality that it is trying to get people out of FDLR in Eastern Congo, which has been running for many years with at least numerically seemingly some success. Based on the sheer fact that the FDLR is much smaller today than it was 10 years ago. But also, if you look at some of the sort of evidence within it, you see these almost circular movements in and out of FDLR. So, I mean, there may be some lessons learned from relatively similar programs elsewhere that could be interesting to discuss. And one thing is this, that it leaves people with, I mean, if you go through this kind of program, you end up with this sort of almost rubber stamp in your head as a former jihadist. And one thing is sort of being sort of rubber stamped as a former ex-combatant. It's probably even more of a stigma of walking around with this former jihadist rubber stamp in your on your forehead. So that is something that I think needs to be discussed more, and I would like both of you to try to expand a little bit on it. And secondly, I mean, what we know from other places and other DDR programs, for instance, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and several other places, is that based on the evidence from those places, I mean, those that reintegrate most easily are those that opted out of these kind of programs. May there be similar dynamics at work in Somalia? Is this something that we just do because we have started doing it and now believe that this must be done everywhere without actually taking into consideration hard evidence that may suggest otherwise? This has a DDR program, a disengagement program, just been part of sort of the international stereotype way of dealing with conflict without asking the question, is this actually working? Or is there any use of doing it? I don't have the answer to that, but I will sort of at least give you that and sort of challenge you to respond to that. And finally, when it comes to this about deradicalization, and I am probably biased here as people who know me know that I'm quite skeptical to that whole idea of deradicalization. One reason is because it's sort of, to me, it's a little bit of some sort of a big brother attempt. I mean, this is big brother society where certain ideas are seen as unwanted and they want to clean them out. I mean, it's a way of sort of a sanitation approach to ideas that we don't like. But what's most important here? Is it to stop people from fighting? or is it to stop them from having ideas that we see as unwanted? I'll leave it to there, but before I allow you to respond to my few challenges, I'm going to take also 3 questions, interventions from the floor. So please, anybody? Yes. I think we have Mohammed. Please stand up and also say, give a name and affiliation.
My name is Mohammed Hussein Gas. I am doing my PhD in us on non-state actors and governance. Also, I'm affiliated with party. My question, I have 2 questions that are related to already what you have. If I can sit, I would be happy. What you have already outlined, I mean, you indicated Malta, but to include and to stay Ghana. To stay Ghana is given that you already maybe explicitly to mention certain factors that led to the emergence of al-Shabaab. Do we see today a trend of similar scenario relating it itself? Now we see, okay, yes, al-Shabaab is at very low level of popularity within the Somali government, inside Somalia. But also we see, certain issues relating to governance, local governance emerging, that they may again use it to their own benefit. They're including, various issues. For example, one of the cities that were captured 10 days ago by the Amazon forces, local inhabitants were going public, some of them, saying they were endless and denouncing, and they were saying we were better off under al-Shabaab. That's for your city. And this has been circulating within Somali media. That's for a state. Which again, does this mean we are not addressing the root cause of the conflict and the whole problem of radicalization, which is governance, providing, as you mentioned, some sort of governance to Somalis. For the I think it's very interesting, but I do think, given the nature and the complexity of the Somali society, what Martin has mentioned already is very relevant. That is a very good example. Because of, al-Shabaab is trying to avoid stigmatization on the level. They run into that crowd and relatives. You had one very unfortunate incident where the head of the security forces in Jubaland was killed by one of his relatives that defended al-Shabaab. Which when that ex-al-Shabaab was put into prison, he said, no, this is my relative, I take full responsibility for him and he will stay with me. How do you deal, or what's your ideas with dealing with such intricate, complex, connections and situations? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Hello, my name is James Cocaine from United Nations University's office in New York. I'm just visiting. Thank you very much to the presenters for great presentations. Questions to anyone and everyone. Stig, the military situation that you described is what is known in the mediation literature as a hurting stalemate. Neither side can win, but we're in a situation where negotiated agreement is potentially the best outcome right now for both sides. Is there any real prospect of a negotiated outcome, given that at least the ideology that's projected by one of the sides is that they wouldn't accept a state-based outcome? And that connects, of course, also to Morton's question that while that might be the ideology, in fact, the mode of governance offered, at least by the local factions of al-Shabaab, is quite similar to statehood. Have we given up on negotiation? If there were a negotiated outcome, it would obviously make the disengagement much easier. So the question is really, have we given up on negotiation altogether? And if so, why?
My name is Gautam Giral from the International Law Policy Institute. My question is to Mr. Yoda. And I have two actually. The first one is I want to question your description of the military situation as a stalemate by asking you, if you can try to quantify, give us some sort of precise picture of the territorial loss of al-Shabaab since its glory days of 2009. They seem to be losing new towns every day. With that, they lose source of income, recruitment potential, and also many of the driving factors that led to the high recruitment levels are perhaps gone today. People's views on Ethiopia, people's views on al-Shabaab as an alternative. I have the impression that has changed to some extent. Second question is related to this one. To what extent can the new emerging quasi-states in southern Somalia fill the vacuum of al-Shabaab? From the outside, it seems that Jubaland seems to be functioning quite well. Similar constellations emerging in Baidala and elsewhere. Are they able to, in the long run, perhaps perform the tasks of statehood that might prevent al-Shabaab from coming back?
Thank you. I'll now allow the panelists sort of 2 minutes each to respond. Okay, 3 then, but I would like us to have the time at least for one more round of interventions from the floor, and I know how talkative some of you are. So we'll start with Alexander.
Thanks, Maureen. Quickly on the state issue, I'll leave most of that to Stick, but it's worth mentioning as he did. Al-Shabaab was born out of the ICU, which was itself perhaps not state building, but that was one of the more successful organizations that created stability in the region. So they had some experience in doing that kind of thing. But in theory, if we're talking about the global jihadi element of al-Shabaab within the group, in theory, the state is not important. Jihad is without borders, if you ask them. Islam is without border. We're talking about an ideology here that transcends nationality, culture, race, and in fact, clan affiliation, and that can be part of its own appeal. Yeah, so I think those are things that are worth bearing in mind when looking at that. On the issue of them providing security and justice, that I think you'll see in other circumstances, a group can come in and do that and be very popular, especially in places that there is no central government control, there is no justice. People want swift justice, they want security, that they can run their lives. But after a while, as people know in totalitarian states, that's not enough, and that will not last. You can't just provide security, and then people will realize what it really is, what it really means to live under a totalitarian, religious, fascist organization, and they're not going to like it. And in fact, we're seeing that pushback now. So providing security is only a short-term thing. It won't be enough to maintain yourself in a society. On the question from Morten about Big Brother and all these issues, and yes, I mean, look, this is an ongoing debate. And really, the question is, do you accept the connection between idea and action? This is controversial in a debate. I personally think it's impossible to claim that there isn't a link between your ideas and your actions. And if you look at the history of terrorism, a lot of it you can very easily prove that there's a very direct link between the ideas that you have and the actions you take. The question is not, we're not talking about putting people who just believe in this into derad programs. We're talking about people who acted on this, who killed, who murdered, who maimed, who raped, who pillaged on the basis of their beliefs. They believe they were justified in doing this on the basis of their, we're not talking about criminalizing this idea. We're talking about dealing with people who acted on it. And if we want to ignore the fact this guy is saying to you, I raped this woman because I believe she was just my property because of the way I've interpreted my religion. Well, how can you say that you don't want to address that? It seems to me absurd to suggest to just ignore the ideas that drive a lot of this. And of course, there are many people in Shabaab, most perhaps, that are not driven by these ideas, but we know that there are some who are. And to ignore the link between action and ideas is a dangerous path to go down, I think. And also, if you look at people who did used to be members of Al-Qaeda, we have a number around, they will tell you the exact same thing. Why don't, I mean, okay, let's not just take everyone's word at face value, but let's listen to what people tell us. Naman bin Odman, former member of the Lebanon Islamic Fighting Group, sat down with bin Laden, planning of 9/11, now works in a think tank in Britain, helping Muslims integrate into Western society, and constantly talks about the importance of addressing the ideas as well as everything else. So I think to pretend like, you know, the current conflicts we're looking at and the global jihadist terrorism that we're looking at doesn't have anything to do with what their ideology tells them, in my opinion, is a big mistake to make. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. First, on the question of the lessons learned from other countries, I don't know the DRC context that well, but this is actually something that we have discussed through this week in this Nairobi workshop, how DDR is going forward, which new trends do we have to take into considerations, and also how to actually gather these lessons learned from different programs that we have globally. Which has not been done to the extent that it should have. I mean, there's a lot of information there, but it's about putting it to the table for the people that are actually implementing in the program. But in that regard, I mean, it's important to have the lessons learned from other similar settings, but what we see is that these programs need to be localized. They need to be adjusted to the local situation and the local context, the local conflict. Which actors are we actually dealing with here? What kind of social processes are we dealing with? So yes, definitely lessons learned, but it needs to be localized. And that's why we also need more information about al-Shabaab. Who are they? Like, who are the individuals in al-Shabaab? What are the motives of going into al-Shabaab? That will inform our approach when trying to get them out as well. So we need to get more detailed information about the groups that we're dealing with, the politics that are happening on the ground. Clan issues is a big issue in Somalia. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration and localized, not only for Somalia and different regions of Somalia, but actually for like each local community. We need to understand what is actually going on the ground there. And when it comes to the stigmatization issue, and yes, you're right. I mean, a lot of people might not be interested in going into the program in the first place, and many people are already left al-Shabaab or in the community and might not need any support. And this is happening on local level anyway. And with or without disengagement or DDR program, people will go back or to other communities some sort of way. So for a program, I think it would be important to actually try to understand these processes and also try to see or gather the information of the people that have already left. How did they leave? Who were the actors involved? How can we support these processes positively that are happening locally? Or at least make sure that we don't spoil these processes by setting up such a program. But I think that's very important. And the issue of security as well, I think that we need to also look at possibilities of transitional justice. You have different types of justice systems in Somalia, and customary law might not be the best way of dealing with this. Maybe you need to have a close cooperation with elders, with religious leaders in the communities that people want to go into, and try to see how we can deal with this on a community basis instead of on an individual basis. To work closely with them. From Sierra Leone, I know that they have several ceremonies when people went back, etc. That could be working in Somalia. It has happened actually in some communities. But what I think is important to emphasize as well is that there have been reports of people coming out of al-Shabaab. They're sort of hovering around the local communities, but not really accepted in. And that is a very important group that such a program can provide security for, at least, and also try to help them in the process of going into the communities afterwards, working with the local communities. So I think there's a need for it, but we need to be very careful about how we do it and how we play this local context, how we not play it, but rather work with it.
Yeah, thank you. I think the two first questions I got from Mohammed and Morten basically has some of the same elements in them. If Shabaab tried to make a proto-state, a stateless inside Somalia, that's quite certain. You know, they addressed the whole line of governance functions. It was important for them, and it was important stressing it in the propaganda because the government failed so utterly in doing the same thing. They created Islamic governance. Mohammed asked the question, but Mohammed and Michael, they wrote a very good article in Jane's intelligence review on this issue. I'm sure that if people are interested, they can ask them afterwards. Michael is this gentleman, so everybody knows that. Governance is extremely important for the Shabaab. It was losing its glory when it started to establish these governance structures and really overdid it and were quite extreme in the implementation. But still, compared, for example, to warlords, if you see in Kismayo, they were basically behaving better, so they were better than the alternative. I think that governance is also something we should look into for the future of the Shabaab. I still think Shabaab has the potential to redeem itself. Definitively, it lost a lot of support when it implemented harsh Sharia. But if we bring back the previous situation, if we bring back the situation where, for example, the transitional federal government managed the justice sector in Mogadishu, basically that gives Shabaab a lot of advantages. It gives Shabaab a lot of advantages because the Somali police was not, it was not only not functioning, it was predatory, outright predatory. So it was stealing money from the local population and killing over mobile phones. And that is, for example, connected to the payment of wages. If we see that type of failures from the government, believe me, there will be some Shabaab sympathies emerging again. It's not a lot of Shabaab sympathies, but they will re-emerge. I think that we can look very carefully at Lower Shabelle. There's signs that the military is going in that direction. The Somali military is clan recruited. They put in a brigade in the same area where the clan in question occupied the area before. We will watch. You know, that's a huge potential for Shabaab recruitment. You just wait and see. I think it's a very important question, and it deserves to be looked into. They lost their glory when it comes to governance, but maybe the governance of the new government will backfire, and then they will get back their glory, and they will get back some sympathies in specific areas. Negotiated this agreement with the Shabaab. The Shabaab's ideology at the top is quite strong. It's very interesting now that we had a showdown last summer, and the second in command, Ibrahim Afghani, was killed, and still Mukhtar Robo, who was the leader of the opposition, he frames Budana as an American spy. That's his rhetoric. It's a very anti-Western attack on Budana from Robo's side. So I think several of the elements that we looked into in the Shabaab will have a hard time entering into negotiations. I do have, I think, somebody that might provide us with a window of opportunity, and that's actually Hassan Yacoubi, who made a lot of strange statements regarding the Ethiopian offensive as of recently. He might be one of the sub-commanders that can be swiped. You know, I don't hope for large gains when it comes to negotiating, but it's possible to get small gains if it's followed up. So we will just have a look at that in the future. And to the gentleman from ELP, yes, I agree. You know, there has been large losses in territory on behalf of the Shabaab. They had similar losses before. Ethiopians in the win in December 2006 didn't work out. It didn't work out at all. And I think you should look carefully into Mogadishu and the dynamics in Mogadishu. Shabaab are still able to tax inside of Mogadishu. They're still able to do operations inside Mogadishu because the local police hasn't been established well enough. The local police today is better than it used to be, but it hasn't been established well enough. If you look into the Arms Monitoring Commission and their work on Kismayo, Kismayo was a large source of income for the Shabaab because they taxed the port. You know what? Today they're still taxing the port. They're just not taxing the port inside Kismayo. They tax it through road blocks outside of Kismayo. And as long as the roads are not properly controlled, that's going to be an issue. And you also have the regionalization. What will the money gathered in the region really? How much money is that? And what will it do to Shabaab? We don't know. You know, but Shabaab has been through a period where they didn't control a single city before and they survived. They scaled down, they saved money, and I think they can survive today. What you need to bring is safety in the countryside, and I cannot see that forthcoming. In order to have safety in the countryside, you need to have fully functioning Somali police that has local legitimacy. And that's a lot of challenges. You know, you need to pay the police. You also need to have a police that is respected by the local clans. As of now, for many fractions in Somalia, both the army and the police are forces of occupation. It's as simple as that. You can see it in Kismayo, you can see it in Baidoa. It has big problems to solve. It has to be solved through a federal process. That process hasn't reached its goal yet. Sorry to Morten for talking too much.
I do, but so that's not a problem. I just want to say, before I give the mic back to the floor, I just want to say two things. I mean, the second is related to what Stig just said. I think that in this kind of insurgency war that we see in Somalia, I mean, we cannot only look at territory, because it's not necessarily just about controlling territory. What is more important is to control population. And even if Shabaab has lost territory, that does not necessarily automatically means that it has lost control of the population, which is ability to tax, still collect taxes within Mogadishu, still very much points to. Secondly, on this small disagreement between me and Alexander on IDs and action, I mean, of course, I also acknowledge the relationship between IDs and action. That's not the issue. I mean, where we may have a disagreement is around two issues. One is, of course, that there are many Muslim groups around the world who are entirely peaceful, but still have ideas about how the world should be organized and how the role of Islam both in politics and society that are relatively close to some of the ideas of these jihadists. But I mean, they have never taken up guns in order to further those issues, and we should be very, very careful about sort of conflating a sort of political / social issues that we tend to dislike because they are very dissimilar to our views about how the world should be organized, that are uttered completely peacefully and therefore should be seen as legitimate, and those that take up weapons in order to further that kind of course. And the danger, I think, is with this now quite huge emphasis on the issue of deradicalization, that we basically tie in to those that are fighting for that course their rhetoric about some sort of a cosmic battle between sort of civilizations, between worldviews and so on and so forth. So that was basically my point. But please, at least we have Jan here. Moment.
Well, I'm Jan Håkonsen from the Research Council of Norway. Although here I'm primarily because of my personal interest in Somalia after long history with that country. I do like Mohammed, I prefer to say. My question, I guess, is primarily to Ingrid, because this disengagement programs, I know very little about them, and it's been interesting to hear about them. But what strikes me is there must be, you probably need a whole series of different disengagement programs. I can see how this could work for the local ex-al-Shabaab members for various reasons. Some of them, as it was indicated, have been recruited into al-Shabaab not necessarily because of their strong ideological Islamism, and they also have the possibility, partly thanks to the clan system, to be reintegrated into the local community. But we have at least two more groups, or maybe three, depending how you define it, of al-Shabaab members. You have these radicalized West or Somalis who have grown up in the West, like these two gentlemen in the video. You have the foreigners, whether they're from Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever they come from. And then perhaps as a separate group, even on the Western were converted to Islam. I hate to see how they can fit into this disengagement camps in my door. Is my what you had stored for them?
Yeah, that's a good, very good question, and I fully agree with you. Oh, I can't.
My name is Hilde Salvesen, Ministry of Home Affairs. I have a question directed to Alexander. You have made a comparison between different kind of programs for disengagement. And I was wondering, given the sensitivities of these kind of programs, have you seen cases where international support to such kind of programs is in fact counterproductive?
I'm Des Malloy. I'm Program Director with the Nippon Foundation supporting conflict-affected communities in Myanmar and formerly UN Chief of DDR in Sierra Leone, Haiti, Central African Republic, and Nepal. So I've been with Ingvild and Alex for the past few days at Nairobi, where we have been reviewing how we will deal with the dynamic evolving approach to DDR in changing scenarios, such as in Somalia. I want to comment on the moderator's comment. Sierra Leone is close to my heart. I finished the program there. I think your comment that perhaps those who avail, who don't access reintegration support may reintegrate better than those who do could be a misunderstanding. I think it's drawn largely from McCartan Humphreys, Jeremy Winstein's What the Fighters Say, a flawed and much disputed study, and 5 following studies from the same database, not least by me, where they say that those who didn't avail of reintegration reintegrated better than those who did. Now, there are about 65,000 troops registered, ex-combatants registered for that program. About 53,000 went through the program and got the support. Of the remaining 12,000 or so, some ran into Liberia or into Cote d'Ivoire, some died and got killed, and some went home because they had coping mechanisms, they had businesses, they had family support. So to say that there is a feeling out there that those who avail of reintegration support do not do better, or that those who don't avail of it may do better, is a bit blasé. There are those who intimated would have coping mechanisms that allow them to avoid the whole stigma of being an ex-combatant. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, and I guess we can continue that debate perhaps after here. But I think we can agree to disagree for now. But are there other questions and comments, not for the moderator, but for the panelists? That do not seem to be the case right now. Then I give the floor back, or the microphone back to the panelists. Maybe we can start with Ingvild and then Stig and finally Alexander. Is that okay?
I think that's a very, very good comment, and I completely agree with you that this process needs to be individualized as well, to know who we're dealing with and their motivations for being there, and what are their motivations for coming out as well. They wouldn't have the same motivations for coming out. If they are highly radicalized, they will most likely continue to fight for the group and stay in the group. Many of these, Alex knows more about this than me, but many go in with the final aim of being suicide bombers, for example. And I'm not sure if there's much this type of program can actually do in that regard. What I think is very important is that if they are actually captured, we need to be very careful about handling them they should definitely not go within the same caseload as those who are not radicalized or didn't go to al-Shabaab in the first place with that ideology, so that we make sure that they're not actually radicalized after coming out. So we need to separate those caseloads. And then I'm not sure, I mean, if you would have a case of somebody actually coming out voluntarily, they wouldn't be interested in doing this type of program in Somalia. Most likely they will like to go home to the country that they were coming from in the first place. And that's something that Norway, for example, needs to look at. What do we do with people who have been in other countries, who have been trained, who have actually been fighters? How do we deal with that when they decide to come home, if they are allowed to come back? Which is a discussion as well. But how do we deal with that? I don't have the answer. Alex might know this a lot better. But you're absolutely right. It's a completely different case, and I'm not sure that this program are able to absorb those. And I mean, if they can't do their aim in Somalia, they might move on to Syria or somewhere else. So, which is also a risk.
Yes, I didn't get any of these questions directly addressed to me, but I can say a little bit about it nonetheless. I think, for example, Norwegian citizens who go to Somalia to fight, that there should probably be mechanisms in place in Norway to handle it, and there should be wider mechanisms. We're talking about programs in Somalia. We know that one of the alleged Westgate perpetrators was identified by the PSD quite early, maybe as early as in 2007. And the apparatus we have to deal with these cases, which has to be personal based, it has to be tailored according to each person, so that's very important, is rather limited. You know, if I should do wishful thinking amongst today, you know, it would be that this person that went and probably participated in Westgate was not only met by the PSD, that he was met by other institutions in Norway at a very early stage, including Somali community institutions, including social services. There's an integration there that needs to be better in Norway. It's proceeded quite far in Oslo. That's good. But we should remember that a lot of this recruitment doesn't take place in Oslo. It's other places. It's Larvik, it's Fredrikstad. They haven't reached that far. So this is something to keep in mind.
Thank you. Yeah, I would echo what Stig said about foreign fighters. I mean, no, there wouldn't be a place for them in a Somali program. What it would be is at least trying to get them before they go, or at least knowing when they've returned and dealing with them. Then I know in the UK, the prevent strategy, which is essentially a counter-radicalization strategy, is trying to look at how to deal with the influx, or rather the migration of a lot of fighters from Britain to Syria. And that's in Europe in general is looking at quite a huge amount of, relatively big amount of foreign fighters going to join jihadi groups in Syria. They will have to look at domestic indigenous programs to try and deal with that. The question on the international assistance, one thing I didn't get a chance to say in the talk was, you know, every type of program like this is going to depend on the local context in which it's operating very, very much. So it really will depend on the local culture's attitude towards the international community. But you know, these programs do suffer from issues of credibility, and they certainly might, you know, they could struggle if they're seen as external projects. They need to be seen as indigenous-led efforts, grassroots-led efforts. But you know, that doesn't mean they can't be assisted. But that really will depend on the context. But it does need to be grassroots. It does need to be shown to be a domestic thing, a domestic response. And you know, there's nothing wrong with the society saying what it's against and acting on that. But it's, you know, again, it's not about criminalizing the ideas. It's about dealing with those who've acted on them. So I think that's important. And just very, very quickly on Warren's point about the on peaceful Islamists. Yeah, of course, most Islamists are non-violent. Worth mentioning that many jihadi groups have their origins in non-violent Islamist groups. But yes, in fact, you might think of these guys as being useful partners in deradicalization programs in cases where you have such extreme situations like in Somalia. these guys might have that very credibility to say, look, they might agree with the world's view, with the way that the world should be run, but they don't agree that you can pursue mass murder in order to do this. So those who do share a lot of the ideological components, but reject the mass murder component, might actually be people you might want to think about utilizing. And Somalia has a pretty vibrant Islamist scene beyond the violent Islamists. So they might be people you might want to go. I don't think in Europe that should be something that we do, but in countries where you're facing this immediate, clear and present danger, as they say, I think you can definitely actually use these guys. They will have that street cred, that credibility. They are not pro-American. They have, you know, different ideas, but they don't believe. The main issue is the killing and the violence. That's the issue. And if they can provide you the ideological firewall, then maybe you can think about using them, in fact, rather than suggesting that it's no point in even pursuing it. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jana, and I'm from the Justice Department. I have a few questions for Stig-Jarle. It's how much internet radicalization is now going on. You mentioned in your book Qatari from 2007, you have alchemists that work in government.info, talk, and so on. And how is that? What's the difference between taking people from the neighboring countries now? You can see al-Shabaab recruiting people from Kenya, Tanzania, Swahili-speaking people. And back in the days it was more radicalization, radicalization from the West, from Norway, England, Britain, Canada, and anywhere. And also, what is the future of Somalia, South Central Somalia? And you mentioned Rwanda falling out with leaders one after one. For example, in the Grand Afghan, you had the Rahman Abu Mansur with his own militia, and it was a big part of al-Shabaab. And also, what is the movement within Hassan Dahir and the Ain clan, which also was a big part of the al-Shabaab movement? Thank you.
We have place for one or two more small interventions from the floor, so if anybody has some issues they would like to raise, please do it right now. Yes, Mohammed, but briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, actually. Steve, it seems that in reality, international actors are regional actors. It seems they are just focused on, physical removal of al-Shabaab by country, different regions in South Central Somalia. Less on, the actual dynamics that either can undermine al-Shabaab and enhance the credibility of the federal government. I would like to hear from the state about that issue, because of that, as it seems, you have, for example, in Baghdad, there is a crisis boiling, similar to this issue, elsewhere in Southern Somalia. Even, last week we had Somalia, almost getting, to start conflict. And how that means to states in the region, and what's the counter-productivity? What are the effects in terms of counter-productivity of what's happening inside Somalia to for example, Kenya, and even beyond?
Thank you. And then I'm going to give the panelists 2 minutes each for final comments. I'll start with the one closest to me that I have some suspicions may try to run over his time. Stig-Jarle.
Thank you very much. Huge questions. Yeah, that's not so easy. As for recruitment of Shabaab, current recruitment in Norway and also in the region. In Norway, there's tendencies that the Somali ethnic community has distanced themselves more from the Shabaab. It's harder for them to sell this nationalist creed to the Somali in Norway. They have committed atrocities in Somalia, and it has been seen by the Somali community. There's two things I want to say. There's signs that there are recruitments through more white Islamist scenes in Norway. So it has been more globalized. You know, there's ethnic Somalis going in groups that are pan-national, that contains other ethnic minorities, and thus end up in Somalia. And there's also instances where they end up inside Syria, in fact. So that's something that we should mark ourselves. In order to believe in Shabaab today, I think you have to be a little bit ignorant about Somalia. And that plays into an American researcher called Steve Wayne, who examined Shabaab recruitments in Minnesota. And he highlighted the generation 1.5, the generation that came quite late but not adult. So they're a little bit lost between two worlds. And in addition to that, they also have lacking understanding of Somalia that makes it easier to frame it in a conflict between Islam and the rest. So generation 1.5, I think, is quite vulnerable in Norway also. That's also something to think about. Regionally, there will be recruitments. Shabaab tried to play on animosity in Tanzania between the mainland and Zanzibar. It's not easy because they also recruit in the mainland. So they have to be careful. They have to avoid playing out these narratives in a regional way, or rather say that this is atrocities against Muslims. So what you see in the propaganda against Kenya and Tanzania is that they try to play on old conflicts by reframing them, like interpreting them, that there are bad treatment of Muslims. And that's what they have to do. It's hard. In the conflict, for example, between Zanzibar and Tanga, it's hard to play that out in that language. So I'm not sure that there will be a wide recruitment through such narratives, but maybe they will fool some. And regional influence and regional interest in Somalia, it's a very broad issue. You know, a lot of the regional countries will think about their own safety. There's also definitively some kind of rivalry of being, you know, a leader in the region. And in that rivalry, I think both Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia will play out. And I think what we see now as of late is that, you know, Ethiopia has gotten their eyes up for Uganda and, you know, are basically raising their feathers and trying to defend their hegemony in one sense. But this is a game that will be ongoing, and it's hard to predict how it will end, and one will probably not allow me to speak more on that issue.
My last comment would be just to emphasize something that Steve mentioned in his presentation as well, and that's the role of AMISOM. And that South Central Somalia is actually dependent on AMISOM for security reasons right now. They are the ones liberating areas, they are the ones maintaining areas. And if they pull out, then what? So there needs to be an emphasis on building up the Somali National Forces, the Somali police that we mentioned earlier on. That means we need a high emphasis on this because AMISOM won't be there forever. And the Somali government and Somali forces need to take over at some point. So there needs to be a training, focus on security sector reforms, also a focus outside of the borders of Mogadishu as well. So yeah, that would be my because everything we do would be depending on AMISOM holding those areas. For the disengagement program, for example, it's highly dependent on AMISOM controlling that area so that it's actually secure for others to come in and intervene.
Thanks. The question wasn't directed at me, but I'll have a quick go at it on the internet radicalization. I mean, this is still a very early sort of research, and this is still, you know, it's not much. the question of, can the internet play a role in somebody's involvement in terrorism? I mean, up until quite recently, the assumption was that it was, the social networks, the physical social networks you're involved with were a very important part of your decision to take part in this. But the question now for researchers is can the internet provide the same service, as it were, a virtual social network, and can it be as effective as a physical one? In the West, we have seen a number of cases where that does appear to have been the case. A number of people who've carried out sort of lower-level terrorist attacks based almost entirely on their involvement online. So I thought in East Africa, I don't think there's any real research on this. We know that there are efforts to use it. Of course, there have a lot of forums. You mentioned Al-Kimma and others. We know that they produced this online magazine, Gandhi Tani, probably not pronouncing that right, but it translates to Street Terrorist in Swahili, based really on the AQAP Inspire magazine, again showing their influence from global actors. So there's clearly an effort to use the internet to reach out. What impact that's having, I think, as far as the real empirical research goes, I don't know if there's any at the moment. But I think it's certainly worth looking at, for sure. And I think, especially if you think about Somali culture, it's very involved in media, online media, well known for that. So it's something that can be used well, both. And when you're talking about counter-radicalization, you can use it as well to try and use the internet as well as they are, as it were, to try and counter the message. And other than that, I think I'll probably leave it at that. But you mentioned if there were sort of non-Somali diaspora going to Somalia to fight. There have been not huge amount of cases. We know the most famous, Omar Hamami, the American, and also Zach Chesser, another American white convert who tried to travel to Somalia and he saw them as being the most authentic Islamic group out there. So they were able to present themselves as being the best. If you want to fight the global jihad, we're the guys to come to, because we're at one point they were succeeding. They were showing the bullet fails that the ballot fails but the bullet doesn't. And so they were, as long as they were actually achieving things in Somalia, they could present themselves as being a legitimate group for this. But I think they might be struggling more to do that now. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, we have reached the limits of this discussion. I am certain that the issues that we have raised here, they will be continued to be about debate and research, and I look forward to following that debate and that research in the future. But right now, please join me in thanking the three panelists for very interesting presentations and good answers to difficult questions.